Hello, class, and welcome to week 8 for Introduction to Psychology 2. Within this week, we will be taking a look at personality. Now, there's a lot to cover in personality, but what I'd like to do is focus it in a little bit. There's lots of different perspectives on personality, but I'm going to start off with one of the big daddies of the field, Sigmund Freud. While there's a lot of controversy about Sigmund Freud, a lot of that has to do with the fact that he became so incredibly influential in the first half of the 20th century. And ever since then, there's been a bit of a backlash against anything Freudian. But there's no denying the fact that Freud had some profound insights about personality and the way personality works. The constructs that he came up with for the psychic apparatus as a basis for understanding personality are very practical from a clinical perspective and from just a life perspective. And it can give you some good insight into how you yourself function on a day-to-day basis. And so I think it's important for us to take a look at Sigmund Freud and the Neo-Freudians, those that came after Sigmund Freud, because there is such an immense wealth of knowledge there. Now, recognizing that this isn't going to cover everything that's in your text, and it's going to add a little bit that isn't in the text, but I do want to kind of cover it from this perspective. A little bit about Freud, just to understand himself as a person. Freud was raised in a very complicated Jewish family relationship. He had older brothers that were in their mid-20s and 30s when he was growing up. And yet he himself, and they were all living in the same household, and yet he himself was really considered the golden child. He was given special privileges at home, and he was such a studious student that his family recognized that he was going to be someone great, and he himself believed that he would be someone great. He spoke 6 languages by the time he was in his tweens, and regularly read Greek tragedies in the original, and was very much interested in becoming a research scientist. Unfortunately, living in Vienna, Austria, in the early part of the late part of the 19th century, there was a quota on who could be accepted into the programs for research science. And so he took a more practical route and studied medicine. It was basically to use his intellectual skills and to make a living. But he was able to combine his vast knowledge of ancient philosophy and tragedy and literature with his scientific education and bring all of that to bear on his clinical practice. And in so doing, he was able to develop some very profound ideas about personality. And we'll take a look at some of those. But just to kind of narrow down our topic for today, when we talk about personality, we're really referring to the long-lasting traits and patterns that really propel individuals to consistently think, feel, and behave in specific ways. Our personality is what really makes us unique individuals. Each individual has an idiosyncratic pattern of enduring longer-term characteristics and a manner in which he or she interacts with the individuals and the world around them, and also with themselves inside of themselves. And our personalities are really thought to be long-term, stable, and really not easily changed. They can be changed, but it's difficult to do so. And the word personality comes from the Latin word persona. And if you're aware of Shakespearean plays, for example, a persona is a mask worn by an actor. So in ancient Greek plays and in an actor would come out and wear a mask that would portray a specific identity, and that would project specific personality traits of the character that they were playing. So it's not everything, but it's a good part of what is able to be seen. And if we were to go back into Greek studies, 2,400 years ago, there was Hippocrates, and the famous Greek physician. And Hippocrates theorized about personality traits and human behavior. And he created this rubric for understanding personality as separate personality temperaments based upon 4 fluids, or what were called humors of the body. So there was the choleric temperament, and that was someone that was dominated by yellow bile from the liver. There was the melancholic temperament, the black bile from the kidneys. The sanguine temperament, dominated by the red blood from the heart, and the phlegmatic temperament from the white phlegm from the lungs. And many centuries later, the influential Greek physician and philosopher Galen built on Hippocrates' theory and suggested that both diseases and personality differences could be explained by an imbalance in the humors, and that each person exhibits one of the 4 temperaments. For example, the choleric person is passionate, ambitious, and bold. The melancholic person is reserved and anxious and unhappy. The sanguine person is joyful and eager and optimistic, and the phlegmatic person is calm and reliable and thoughtful. And really, Galen's theory was prevalent for over 1,000 years and continued to be popular into the Middle Ages. And I want you to just recognize that there is some wisdom in it. Obviously, it's wrong on many levels, but there is also some truths to what was being said with Hippocrates and Galen. And then we have, in 1870, we have someone by the name of Franz Gall, a German physician. And he proposed that personality traits could be measured. Now, he thought that had to do with the brain, which is all good. Unfortunately, he believed that the bumps on the skull corresponded with the function of the brain, and that by measuring the bumps on the skull, you could measure personality traits, which we now know is false, but at the time, it was an interesting theory for understanding and recognizing that there are certain personality traits and characters and mental abilities that are specific to different areas of the brain. Now, there's also been work on the primary temperaments by people like Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, and the German psychologist Wilhelm Wundt in the 19th century. Kant wanted to build upon the ideas of Galen, that everyone could be sorted into one of these basic temperaments, and that there really isn't a lot of overlap in the various categories. And he developed a list of traits that could be used to describe the personality of a person for each of these 4 temperaments. Now, Wundt, by contrast, suggested that a better description of personality could be achieved using a multi-axial system. So there's the axis of emotion versus non-emotion, and then the axis of changeable versus non-changeable or unchangeable. And the first axis separated strong from weak emotions, so you have the melancholic and choleric temperaments from the phlegmatic and the sanguine. And the second axis divided the changeable temperaments, so choleric and sanguine, from the unchangeable ones, the melancholic and phlegmatic. And this was all done in an attempt to understand personality. And then Sigmund Freud came along. And Sigmund Freud's psychodynamic perspective on personality was one of the first comprehensive theories of personality, explaining a wide variety of both normal and abnormal behaviors. Now, according to Freud, unconscious drives influenced by sex and aggression, so the eros drive and the thanatos drive, along with early childhood sexuality, real or imagined, are really the forces that influence our personality. Now, Freud attracted a lot of followers, and he continually pushed the importance first of sexuality, eros, but later on of thanatos as well, the death drive, the self-destructive drive. And he continually modified and created theories about personality. And many of the people that followed him or were strongly influenced by him or that were part of his inner circle at one time are really referred to as the Neo-Freudians. They generally agree with Freud that early childhood experiences matter, but they typically take a reduced emphasis on the importance of eros, of sex, and they tend to focus more on the social environment and the effects of culture on personality. So the perspective of personality proposed by Freud and later on by his followers really, as I already mentioned, dominated personality theory in the first half of the 20th century. So we'll take a look at those. I think it's important for us to understand those and have a good grounding in them. And then when you continue your studies later on, or when you are reading in your textbook, you can have this as a good foundation for your studies. So let's take a look at Sigmund Freud first. Born in 1856, he died in 1939. He spent most of his life in Vienna, Austria. However, during the Nazi occupation in Vienna, he did escape to London, where he eventually died. So that's just a little bit about his background, but I want to kind of focus in on his theories. So when reading Freud's theories, it's really important to remember that he was a medical doctor. There wasn't really what you would call a psychologist back in that day. He was more what you would think of as a psychiatrist. But he laid the foundations for understanding psychology. He was really the first person to systematically study and to theorize the workings of what we now know as the unconscious mind. Now, in the early years of his career, he focused in on looking at anxiety disorders. And the reason he did that was simply to make some money. And he worked with a fellow by the name of Joseph Breuer, who was a Viennese physician. And during this time, Freud was really intrigued by the story of one of Breuer's patients. This patient was known in most literature by the pseudonym Anna O. And Anna O had been caring for her dying father when she began to experience symptoms such as partial paralysis, headaches, blurred vision, amnesia, and hallucinations. Now, in Freud's day, these symptoms were commonly referred to as hysteria. And so Anna O turned to Breuer for help, and he spent 2 years treating Anna O and discovered that allowing her to talk about her experiences seemed to bring some relief from her symptoms. And Anna O called the treatment of Breuer's the talking cure. Now, despite the fact that Freud never met Anna O, her story really served as the basis of a work that Freud co-authored with Breuer called Studies in Hysteria. And based on Breuer's description of Anna O's treatment, Freud concluded that hysteria was the result of sexual abuse in childhood, and that these traumatic experiences had been hidden from consciousness. Now, Breuer disagreed with Freud, which soon ended their work together. However, Freud continued to work to refine talk therapy and built his theory of personality around what he learned while in the midst of working with people with this talk therapy. Now we call it psychotherapy or psychoanalytic therapy. Now, to explain a little bit of the concept of conscious versus unconscious experience, Freud compared the mind to an iceberg. He said that only about 1/10 of our mind is conscious, that's something that we ourselves are aware of and can read at the present moment. And the rest of our mind is unconscious. It's a vast storehouse, but we don't have access to it, or we have difficult access to it. It can reveal itself to us, but it's still hidden from us for the most part. Our unconscious refers to the mental activity of which we are unaware and are unable to access. According to Freud, unacceptable urges and desires are kept in our unconscious through a process called repression. For example, we sometimes say things we don't intend to say by unintentionally substituting another word for the one we meant. And this is what we call the Freudian slip, the term used to describe this unintentional slip of the tongue. And it usually, according to Freud, are slips of the tongue that are actually sexual or aggressive urges, and they accidentally slip out of our unconscious. And these speech errors, he would argue, are our unconscious nervous eros drive revealing itself, slipping through the ego screen that we put in place. Now, according to Freud, our personality develops from a conflict between two forces. Our biological aggressive and pleasure-seeking drives, so our Thanatos drive and our Eros drive, versus our internal socialized control over these drives, our ego. Our personality is the result of our efforts to balance these two competing forces. And Freud suggested that we can understand this by imagining three interacting systems within our mind. And he called them the id, the ego, and then the superego. So, The id is the unconscious. The id contains our most primitive drives and urges, and these are present from birth. And it directs our impulses for hunger, for thirst, and for sex. And it's very difficult to honestly deny that we have these urges. Freud believed that the id operates on what he called the pleasure principle, in which the id seeks immediate gratification. It wants to have those drives satisfied. But, however, through social interaction with parents and others in the child's environment, the ego and superego develop to help control the id. Now, the superego develops as a child interacts with others, learning that there are social rules, that there is a right and a wrong. So the superego acts as our conscience. It's our moral compass that tells us how we should behave. It strives for perfection and judges our behavior, and it leads us to feelings of pride, or, when we fall short of the ideal, feelings of guilt. In contrast, the instinctual id and the rules-based superego, the ego is the rational part of our personality. It's what Freud called our self, our ego. So it's not pride and arrogance. For Freud, the ego or ego, however you want to pronounce it, is part of our personality that is seen by others. Its job is really to balance the demands of the id and the superego in the context of reality. So we want to fulfill our desires for hunger, thirst, and sex, but we also want to be portrayed as the ideal, and the ego's job is to make decisions moment to moment to help balance those in some kind of appropriate way to minimize harm to ourselves. And so Freud called that balancing the reality principle, where the ego helps the id satisfy its desires in a realistic way. So the id and superego are in constant conflict, essentially. This is internal conflict within ourselves. Because the id wants instant gratification, regardless of the consequences, that could cause a lot of trouble. But the superego tells us that we must behave in socially acceptable ways. So, the ego's job is to find that middle ground, to help satisfy the id's desires in a rational way that will not lead us to feeling guilty. Now, according to Freud, a person who has a strong ego, which can balance the demands of the id and the superego, has a healthy personality. And Freud maintained that imbalances in the system can lead to a neuroses. And what a neuroses was back in Freud's day, in the Freudian terminology, is essentially experiencing of negative emotions, of feeling an emotional disorder, but still being in touch with reality. So it's not a psychosis where you've lost touch with reality, but it's suffering emotionally, but you're still in touch with reality. And so things like anxiety disorders or unhealthy behaviors are neuroses caused by this imbalance of the conflict between these parts of your personality structure. So, for example, a person who is dominated by their id might be narcissistic and impulsive. A person that is dominated by their superego might be controlled by feelings of guilt and deny themselves even simple, socially acceptable pleasures. Conversely, if the superego is weak or even absent, so the person doesn't have a conscience, a person might become a psychopath and just harm people or take things without any regard for the consequences, because they don't have any regard for the consequences. They are driven by only one part of their personality. An overly dominant superego might be seen really as an over-controlled individual whose rational grasp on reality is so strong that they're unaware of even their own emotional needs. Or they may be overly anxious, overly neurotic, overly defensive. And so Freud believed that feelings of anxiety resulted from the ego's inability to mediate the conflict between the id and superego. Now, when this happens, Freud believed that the ego seeks to restore balance through various protective measures known as defense mechanisms. In other words, your brain tries to trick itself to make you feel better. When certain events or feelings or yearnings cause an individual anxiety, the individual wishes to reduce that anxiety. And to do that, the individual's unconscious mind uses ego defense mechanisms, unconscious protective behaviors that aim to reduce anxiety. The ego, usually conscious, resorts to unconscious strivings to protect the ego from being overwhelmed by all of this anxiety. And when we use defense mechanisms, we are unaware that we are using them. Moreover, they tend to operate in various ways that will distort our sense of reality. And according to Freud, we all use defense mechanisms. So there's no point in denying that we don't. That in denying that we don't use defense mechanisms really is a defense mechanism. Now, we can argue that while everybody uses defense mechanisms, Freud believed that overuse of them can become very problematic. So let's say you have a big muscular football player. But deep down, this big muscular football player feels sexually attracted to males. His conscious belief is that being gay may be wrong, and he's caught that from his family. And so he's afraid his family will disown him and that he'll be ostracized by his peers. So there's a conflict between his conscious belief and his unconscious urges. And the idea that he might be gay causes this football player to have feelings of anxiety. So how can he decrease his anxiety? Maybe he begins acting more manly and begins picking on stereotypically gay peers. And in this way, this macho athlete is managing his unconscious impulses, and they are submerged. So that would be an example. So there are many different types of defense mechanisms. For instance, in repression, anxiety-causing memories from consciousness are blocked. As an analogy, let's say your car is making a strange noise, but because you don't have any money to get it fixed, you just turn up the radio to mask the strange noise. That's the kind of thing that happens, Freud would say, in your psychic apparatus, your psyche. Now, I should probably clarify here that when I speak of psychic apparatus, I'm not speaking of someone being a psychic where they can read someone's mind or that they can tell the future or anything like that. A psychic apparatus just refers to a way of understanding the psyche, the mind, and a structural way of conceiving of the way the mind works. That's all. So that's a little bit about defense mechanisms. Moving on a little bit to Freud's understanding of how personality develops, he believed that childhood and childhood experiences and relationships with caregivers was a significant part of this. However, he believed that the eros drive, the way that we find pleasure, and the different means for finding pleasure changes as the child develops. So childhood experiences shape our personalities as well as our behavior as adults. And really, he asserts that we develop personality through stages during childhood. And each of us must pass through these stages in childhood. And if we do not have the proper nurturing and parenting during a stage, we will become stuck or fixated at a stage, even as adults. And in each what is called psychosexual stage of development, the child's pleasure-seeking urges coming from the id are focused on a different part of the body, a different area called the erogenous zone, an area that is the source of pleasure, of eros. And the stages are oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. Now, Freud's psychosexual development theory is quite controversial. But to understand the origins of the theory, it's helpful to be familiar with what was going on in Vienna in the early part of the 20th century. So you need to be mindful that during this time was the Victorian era where Europe was very sexually repressed. And talk of sex was taboo. And so that's part of the reason why there was not a great acceptance of Freud at the time, but also maybe part of the reason why Freud decided to focus on sex, because it was such a hidden force. But let's go on to the first stage, the oral stage of childhood development. In the oral stage, which Freud believed was between birth and the first year, pleasure is focused on the mouth, and eating and the pleasure derived from sucking, nipples or pacifiers or thumbs, played a large part in the baby's first year of life. At around a year of age, the babies are weaned from the bottle or the breast, and this process can create conflict if not handled properly by caregivers. Now, according to Freud, an adult who, say, smokes too much or drinks too much or overeats or bites their nails is fixated on the oral stage of the psychosexual development. And this person may not have been weaned properly, either too early or too late. And that resulted in these fixation tendencies. And all of which seeks really to ease the anxiety that they experience. And then there's the anal stage. And after passing through the oral stage, children enter what Freud termed the anal stage. And that would be typically from ages 1 through to 3. And in this stage, children experience pleasure in their bowels and bladder movements. So it makes sense that the conflict in this stage is over toilet training. And Freud suggested that success at the anal stage depended on how parents handled toilet training. Parents who offer praise and rewards encourage positive results and can help children feel competent. Parents who are harsh in toilet training can cause a child to become fixated at the anal stage, leading to the development of an anal retentive personality. And according to Freud, the anal retentive personality is stingy and stubborn and has a compulsive need for order and neatness and might be considered a perfectionist. And if parents are too lenient in toilet training, the child might also become fixated and display an anal expulsive personality. An anal expulsive personality is messy and careless and disorganized and prone to emotional outbursts. Then from ages 3 through to 6, Freud surmised that there was the psychosexual developmental stage of the phallic stage. And this corresponds to the age when children become aware of their bodies and recognize that there's differences between boys and girls. And so the erogenous zone in this stage is the genitals. And conflict arises when the child feels a desire for the opposite sex parents and jealousy and hatred toward the same sex parent. So for boys, this is called the Oedipus complex, involving a boy's desire for his mother and his urge to replace his father, who is seen as a rival for the mother's attention. Girls experience a comparable conflict in this phallic stage, and Freud surmised that this is the Electra complex. And the Electra complex, although technically that's not a Freudian thing, but a Carl Jung idea, is the idea that a girl desires the attention of her father and wishes to take her mother's place. Then there is the latency period. Following the phallic stage, the child will enter the latency period, and this normally continues from ages 6 years of age through to puberty. And this period is not considered a stage because sexual feelings really become dormant as children focus on other pursuits such as school and friendships and hobbies and sports and learning to be social. And children generally engage in activities with peers of the same sex. And this typically serves to consolidate a child's gender role identity. And then finally, there's the genital stage. The final stage in the genital stage is the genital stage, and that's from puberty onward. In this stage, there is really a sexual awakening, and the young person redirects these urges to others, to finding a more socially acceptable partner. People in this stage have mature sexual interests, which for Freud meant strong desires for another adult, another consenting peer. While most of Freud's ideas have not found support in a lot of modern research, nonetheless, there is this sense that the basic ideas go a long ways to beginning the journey towards understanding other people. And I'm just going to highlight a few other people. There's Alfred Adler, who was a colleague of Freud's and was the first president of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, which was really Freud's inner circle. Now, he did have a conflict with Freud and ended up speaking with Freud, and it was mainly over Freud's insistence on the power of sexuality in the personality. For Adler, the concept of inferiority or the inferiority complex has a huge role to play, where you the inferiority in childhood is what drives people to attempt to gain superiority, and that this striving is the force behind all of our thoughts and emotions and behaviors. And so Adler was not so concerned about our genetic makeup so much as the importance of social connections, especially childhood social connections. And that became the most important thing. Then there's Erik Erikson. And Erikson met Freud's daughter, actually, Anna Freud, and was strongly influenced by Anna Freud, who was a child psychologist. And Erikson proposed a psychosocial theory of development that encompasses the whole lifespan, and identified that there was a number of stages that people go through and values conflicts that they go through in this process of development. And then finally there's Carl Gustav Jung, probably one of Freud's favorite proteges. He also split off with Freud over this argument over the importance of sexuality. Yet Jung still seems to build upon a lot of what Freud viewed as important, like the unconscious. In fact, Jung took the unconscious, the personal unconscious, to a greater degree, and argued that even down in our DNA, there is what he would call the unconscious. It's a universal notion, or a universal version of our personal unconscious, and that there are certain patterns of thinking, certain visual stimuli, certain ways of understanding archetypes and myths and literature and dreams that are really even embedded in our DNA and can be found in every person. And that part of what we need to do in our life's journey is to actualize and understand and have a relationship with our unconscious. Jung is also very famous for the attitudes of relationship with the external world and our personality. So the ideas of extroversion and introversion. Are we related to and energized by the external world, the extrovert, or are we energized by our internal world of thoughts and feelings, the introvert? And Jung also viewed the concept of the persona as being an extremely important part of who we are. He would argue that everybody walks through life not letting people see who they truly are. We put on a mask, we put on our persona, and insist that that is what other people see in us. And so it's very difficult to truly know someone else unless we can convince that person to put down their mask, to put down their persona. And then we shouldn't be shocked when we discover the deeper parts of a personality, because that is who all people are. They are not their persona. And then finally there's Karen Horney, who was one of the first women trained in Freudian psychoanalysis. And during the Great Depression, Horney moved to Germany, from Germany through to the United States, and subsequently moved away from Freud's teachings, but still had this Freudian foundation. Now, Horney also disagreed with the Freudian idea that girls have what was called penis envy and were jealous of male biological features. And according to Horney, any jealousy is most likely culturally based due to the greater privileges that males often have, meaning that the difference between men's and women's personalities really are culturally based, not biologically based. Now, as far as Horney's theories they really focused on the role of unconscious anxiety. And she suggested that normal growth can be blocked by basic anxiety stemming from needs not being met, such as childhood experiences of loneliness or isolation. And so it's a large question of how do children learn to handle this anxiety, because anxiety is, for the most part, universal. Is there a coping style of moving toward people, relying on affiliation and dependence, or is it a coping style of moving against people, relying on aggression and assertiveness? So overall, we can see that Freud's ideas, as well as the neo-Freudians of Alfred Adler and Carl Jung and Erik Erikson and Karen Horney, as well as Freud's own daughter, Anna Freud, really build upon some basic